and Yogacara. We spoke yesterday about Madhyāntavibhāga a little bit. We read from the root verses of the Middle Way by Nagarjuna. Today, I wanted to start at least with another text. It's very dear to me, very important historically. And we'll see. I may call an audible in the second half. We'll see. But this text that I wanted to start with today is called the Madhyāntavibhāga. You may hear Madhya in the beginning of that. It's not an accident. It's the same word as in Madhyamaka. It means middle. And the name of the text, Madhyāntavibhāga, means distinguishing the middle from the ends or the extremes. Anta, like, and again, related to the English word end. Distinguishing the middle from the ends, from the extremes. By way of historical background, this text was taught by the future Buddha Maitreya. There is a lovely tanka of Maitreya in our Lakang. You can go take a look. If you're facing the statues, on the left side, the first is there's a nice little plaque that describes, since we're all beginners here, and part of what we're doing is sort of general Buddhist background, it should be mentioned that Buddhist cosmology is an infinite multiverse. There is an infinite sea of universes. We are extraordinarily fortunate not simply to have taken birth in a human body, which is the most conducive to Dharma practice in all of samsara, but to have taken human birth in what's called a good eon, a good kalpa, a good universe. Why do we call it a good universe? Because not every universe has a Buddha that appears. Most universes do not. Our universe, not only do we get one Buddha, which would be extraordinarily fortunate by itself, we get 1,000. Buddha Shakyamuni, formerly Siddhartha Gautama, is only the fourth. The third was what? Dibamkara, and I forget the other two. But our Buddha Shakyamuni is only the fourth in a line of 1,000. The fifth will be Maitreya, who is currently hanging out in the Tushita heaven. I mentioned yesterday the half-brothers, Asanga and Vasubandhu. We read on the first day from the Abhidharmakosha and Abhidharmakosha Bhashyam of Vasubandhu. Time permitting, and see how it goes today, we may read a little bit more Vasubandhu after the break. His older half-brother, Asanga, has a very interesting life story that I think it's worth saying at least a little about before we proceed. Asanga was also, like many in the time period, born to a Brahmin family, converted to Buddhism. Oral tradition says first to Sarvastivada, which again, this was just the kind of dominant, in its time, was the dominant tradition. But there was the nascent Mahayana movement, which a Sangha also became a part of. A Sangha went, so the story goes, to a cave or maybe a forest to meditate in solitude. He was particularly devoted to the future Buddha Maitreya, which this is also the same root in Sanskrit and Pali as metta or maitri, loving kindness, yes? Maitreya's special characteristic is metta, loving kindness. A Sangha meditated for 3 years, day in and day out, without accomplishing anything. So he gave up in frustration. And as he was leaving, he saw a villager trying to get rid. There was a boulder or a stone or something that was blocking his view. And the villager was trying to get rid of the stone by rubbing a feather on it. And Asanga thought to himself, if this poor villager can show such dedication to a kind of stupid task like this, I can try harder. So he went back for another 3 years. Again, no result. Again, he gave up. As he was leaving this time, so the story goes, he saw a different villager trying to make a needle out of an iron pole by rubbing it with a cloth. Now, again, what do these stories tell us? What are we learning from these stories? What is this a metaphor for or about? The process of cultivation is gradual, and there's a great deal of effort that we must apply in order to attain any kind of result. Our minds are like the stone, our minds are like the iron pole. Meditation is like rubbing it with a cloth to make it a needle. Skip to the end. After 12 years of this, Asanga finally had enough. And once and for all, I'm done. And on his way out, on the road, he saw a dog, filthy, mangy, with open sores and maggots crawling on its side. And he was so overwhelmed with compassion. He thought, this poor dog, but also these poor maggots are also sentient beings. I want to help the dog, this poor flea-ridden, mangy, desperate creature, but I don't want to hurt the maggots. So he decided he would lick the maggots off of the dog's wounds, open sores, to push them out of the way so the dog would have some relief, but the maggots wouldn't be harmed. And in the instant, as he brought his tongue, just as about to touch the dog, transformed into the Buddha Maitreya. Asanga was kind of upset, as you might imagine. So I've been meditating in this cave for 12 years, and now you show up? Maitreya said, it's taken you 12 years to refine your mind, to generate the kind of compassion necessary. I've been here all along, but you couldn't see me. At which point, Maitreya took Asanga up to the Tushita heaven and taught him what we now have are called the 5 treatises of Maitreya. These are the core of the Tibetan scholastic curriculum. You will study in Shedra other texts the Mula Banyamaka Karika, and lots of stuff. The core of the curriculum are these 5 texts, these 5 treatises of Maitreya. Madhyāntavibhāga is, I think, for me speaking personally, I think it's very condensed. It's somewhat easy to read, but Mahayana Sutra Alamkara, the ornament of the Mahayana Sutras, is extraordinarily long. Really, it's a compilation of Mahayana Sutras and sort of, an attempt at systematizing. Madhyāntavibhāga is a condensed presentation. And what's interesting about it, there's many things interesting about it, but I'll just start with the first 2 verses, which in a sense, I think contain it all. The false imagination exists. In it, the two, or duality, in Sanskrit, dvaya, same like dual, do not exist. Emptiness exists there, and within it, that exists as well, that being the false imagination. We'll get to that in a second. Not empty, not empty. This explains it all. Because of existence, non-existence, and existence, this is the path of the middle way. So, explicitly, in the text itself, Maitreya, through a Sangha, is teaching what he calls the middle way. This is another way of thinking about the middle way, another way of approaching the middle way. Not so much as per yesterday in Nagarjuna, in terms of existence and non-existence, but in terms of what are called the 3 natures. This is a really central Yogacara teaching. This is the core, one way of thinking about the core of the Yogacara. What is Yogacara? Yoga, we all know. I have a decent enough sense, I think. Achara is from the same Sanskrit root as karma. Kar means do, act, practice. Yogachara is yogic practice. So when Maitreya / Asanga says the false imagination exists, this is a little bit of a tricky point, so I want to make it clear. He's talking about this guy, the dependent nature, which is also identified as dependent origination, pratitya samutpada, like we were talking about yesterday. All of dependent origination is subsumed under the dependent nature, which is also known as the false imagination, abhuta parikalpa. Abhuta, bhu, like yesterday, same Sanskrit root as bhava. Abhuta, non-existent. Yes? False. The false imagination exists. Dependent origination exists. It is real. In it, dvaya, the 2, do not exist. What are the 2? These are subject and object, phenomenal subject and phenomenal object. We'll discuss these more later. I just wanted to emphasize at the outset that together, subject and object, this duality, are identified as the imaginary, the imagined, the constructed nature, parikalpa. This Sanskrit root kulp, where we get parikalpa, is the same root as concept. we'll be talking about more tomorrow and the next day. Concept is kalpana. Imagination, conceptualization, imaginary, conceptualized, constructed, arranged. All kind of synonymous in this picture. Point being, this is real. Dependent origination is real in the Yogacara picture. What is not real is the dualistic mode of its phenomenal presentation. And the absence, the emptiness of duality in reality is the perfected nature. Parinishpana, which is also the same root as where people talk about sometimes, you may have heard completion stage. Actually, the exact same word, parinishpana. The absence of phenomenal duality, of subject-object duality in the dependent nature, the absence of the constructed or imagined nature, in a sense, you could say conceptualized. I want to talk, I think, more about this tomorrow to draw the distinction, because this is a key point of difference, in fact, between the earlier Yogacara presentation and the later Pramana presentation of especially Dharmakirti, also Dignaga. But for the later tradition, subject-object duality is not conceptual. This is a non-conceptual type of problem. We'll discuss that more later. For Vasubandhu and the Sangha and the early Yogacharans, subject-object duality is essentially described as a conceptual problem. Again, imagined, constructed, conceptualized, all kind of the same thing. Like who? I mean, I know like Dali and absolutely. Just it's no worries. You had a question? That's right. I mean, I'm just quoting from the text. I mean, I'm using my preferred This is one I will say I like this edition. It's not as canonical to me as I think the Siddharits Katsura MMK is like, I couldn't imagine trying to really do a new edition. This one a little. They say the false imagination exists in it. The two do not exist. Yeah. Yeah, I like that. So, great question. Are you asking why it's false or why it exists, or both? Right. Right. That's a great question. So I don't know if it's in. So I put in your packets the first 12 verses, which I don't believe. Yeah, here we go. Verses 3 and 4. Appearing as objects, sentient beings, the self, and awareness, consciousness arises. Its objects do not exist, therefore it does not exist either. Thus the false imagination is established. This is not how it is, yet it is not absolutely nothing either. Liberation is held to follow its exhaustion. The commentary, which I believe is Kempo Shenga, writes, what is the false imagination? It is the all-ground consciousness, the storehouse consciousness, which itself appears as the diversity of phenomena. It appears as external objects, such as form and so forth, as sentient beings endowed with faculties, such as that of the eye and so on, as the self, which refers to the defiled mental cognition, and as awareness, the six collections. You may recall from our first day, when I drew the Abhidharma picture, we had the six The 5 sensory consciousnesses plus the mental consciousness plus the defiled mental consciousness plus the storehouse or all-ground consciousness. What is the false imagination? What is the dependent nature? In this picture, it is the 8 collections of consciousness. It is the 5 sensory consciousness, mental consciousness, defiled mental consciousness, and storehouse consciousness. If you aggregate, as in skanda, all of the 8 consciousnesses of all beings throughout samsara, that's the dependent nature. And it is, and all the various phenomena, again, pheno in Greek, I appear, to appear, phenin, that which appears, the sum total of appearance is the dependent nature. Everything that appears is the dependent nature. The key point, and we can discuss more today, and we will definitely be discussing tomorrow and Friday. There is appearance. That's not in question. The issue is, what is the mode of appearance? Is duality, phenomenal duality, inherent to appearance? Yes.
You saw Dadaism.
Dadaism, yes.
Nudity. And so we saw something for Dali done in the 44. It was titled "A Dream Caused by the Flight of a Bee Around a Pomegranate, a second before waking up."
Right. Yeah. This is so. A couple of things I want to. We are now firmly here in Yogacara world in the realm of like meditation practice, right? And in which dreams and visions and waking appearances, the line is not so solid, especially once we're talking about the suspension of subject-object duality. On which note, I want to emphasize in the Western tradition, especially really since the 18th century with Kant, but also Husserl and you could say before that as well, but certainly in what you could call modern Western philosophy, subject-object duality is taken to be basic, unproblematic, not something that it's possible to get rid of, and if it were, not something that it would be desirable to get rid of. Here, it's quite the opposite. Here, subject-object duality, in a sense, is identified as the core problem. What is yogic practice? What is meditation practice aimed at? What is it about? What is it for? In this picture, getting rid of subject-object duality. And I think you'll find, just a guess, this is me speculating, don't take it to the bank, but I would wager that when Rinpoche comes and begins teaching Mahamudra, that he will say things that you will find very much along these lines. Because this really is the origin or the intellectual bedrock of the Mahamudra tradition, which, I mean, Mahamudra is a Sanskrit word. This tradition existed in India, yes. Yogacara really much more so than Madhyamaka, was the foundation of Indian Buddhist scholasticism. They had the great Mahaviharas, the great monastic universities, tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of monks studying. What were they learning? Abhidharma and Yogacara. We had it was a very, I think I quite liked our class yesterday on Nagarjuna. I think we got a sense of how language itself fails. What would it mean to study Nagarjuna? Okay, you can read the text, we can study, contemplate, meditate on the text. This is great, highly encouraged. Not exactly the sort of thing that lends itself to months or years of detailed scholastic analysis. There are hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, millions of pages written on Madhyamaka. I wonder how much of that is really kind of just missing the point. I don't think you can quite say the same thing, certainly not about Abhidharma and even really about Yogacara. So you can see how it much more naturally lends itself to in-depth scholastic philosophical analysis. And yes, at the same time, when we start analyzing, what is the object of analysis, right? Here, we're talking about the 8 collections of consciousness, their interrelations with each other, all the wild variety of phenomenal appearances in samsara. From a certain kind of Madhyamaka perspective, and this is where, because there is a historical tension, right? In Tibet, it gets kind of played up. In India, it wasn't, I think there was much more of a kind of synthesis, was the general perspective. Certainly, you may have heard the name Shantarakshita, who was the monastic professor who was invited by King Trisong Detsen of Tibet, along with his disciple Hillary, Kamalashila, thank you. Shantarakshita and Kamalashila invited to Tibet. Yes? They placed Madhyamaka kind of at the pinnacle. But if you read they wrote texts, and they're beautiful texts, studied to this day. The actual nitty-gritty is happening here, right? Madhyamaka is kind of like, and then once you've done all this analysis, oh, and by the way, it's, empty beyond existence and non-existence and Nagarjuna stuff, like cherry on top. The meat happens here. And yet, and this is the crucial point again, what would it mean for there to be an appearance without duality? I said before that this is where sort of Western philosophy, that's the precise point. That's the reason why Western philosophy tends to regard this as irreducible and ineliminable. Can't get rid of it. Why? Because what would it mean for there to be an appearance? In particular, when we talk about an appearance, sort of goes without saying, we're talking about an object appearance, right? What would it mean for there to be an object appearance without a subject appearance? If there is no subject and object, in what sense is there an appearance at all? And that's the perfected nature. Questions? If not, I wanted to read briefly. This is from, I mentioned the Mahayana Sutra Alamkara, another one of the 5 treatises of Maitreya. Reality, tattva, which is always without duality, is the basis of error and is entirely inexpressible. It does not have the nature of discursivity, which is a fancy Western philosophy word for like talking about stuff or thinking about stuff. It is to be known, abandoned, and purified. It should properly be thought of as naturally immaculate, since it is purified from defilements, as are space, gold, and water. So you may have heard, or maybe not, maybe this is the first time, that's okay, but you'll hear it many times if you stick around. This crucial metaphor of gold, which is particularly important in the Uttara Tantra Shastra, or the Madhyāntavibhāga, the Gyulama in Tibetan, the supreme continuum, generally counted as the final, the 5th and final of these treatises. This is the real classical Indian source on Buddha, what's translated as Buddha nature, Tathagata Garbha, the matrix, the womb of the Tathagatas. Great. I mean, yeah. Right? What's a Garbha? Literally a womb. Matrix, as in mother. But also, I mean, what's a matrix? The grid where things exist, right? An algebraic object to be manipulated, perhaps.
And mentioned I was in Spain, and I love Cervantes, and I brought home the novel, and so I've been obsessed with my whole life with Cervantes, and this multiverse that Cervantes created when he wrote about Don Quixote, the craziness of the multiverse, and yet the sanity of Tilting windmills, of the fact that, you know, it's all crazy. So why not be authentic and go after what you think is real?
So this is where I think this is where it's important. I think that is there's always a trade-offs, I guess, is how I would think about it. There's always trade-offs. Nagarjuna, like the real hardcore Madhyamaka, in which, you know, again, all of this, from if you want to be a kind of hardcore Madhyamaka about it, you could, yes, and historically it was the case, especially in Tibet, you could sort of turn your nose up at this whole picture and say, well, you say all this stuff exists, but what do you mean by existence? And I think there you see the danger of slipping into a kind of ethical nihilism. Here, in this picture, why do we start out by saying the false imagination exists? That's equivalent to saying karma exists and karmic effects exist. Why do things appear? Why do things appear the way they do? Because of karma, right? Because of actions and their effects. This cycle. So there's I think, a kind of grounding, ethical grounding, that's much more pronounced here and in the Yogacara picture, which also provides us, I mean, again, I wouldn't exactly say Yogacara partisan. I like the kind of late Indian Yogacara Madhyamaka synthesis. But if I had to pick one, yes, I'm a Yogacara guy. partially for that reason, and partially because I think this emphasis on phenomenal duality as really the central concern of meditation practice is very beneficial, very helpful. And in particular, for the kinds of meditation instruction that Rinpoche will be giving, this is the intellectual foundation of that, and the historical foundation. This is where all that comes from, that whole language. So study it well. I think we have a little bit of time. I don't know if you don't want to take a break, we don't have to. I was going to pivot. That reminds me of one other thing, but before we do, but yes, I on this note, I was thinking to pivot because again, there's just such a wealth in India of Yogacara materials, and it's so important to the Tibetan tradition. There's some other materials that I would like to discuss if we have the time. It seems we might. But again, because this is so crucially important, before I pivoted, really, if you have questions, do you have a question or? Sorry? Sure, go ahead. Sorry, could you speak up? Of Mahamudra, yes. She's saying that Yogacara is the basis of Mahamudra. Yes, very much so. What is the perfected nature? When we say appearances, i.e. the dependent nature, purified, like gold, right? This metaphor I sort of trailed off earlier in the Gyulama, in the supreme continuum, unexcelled, whatever. It's like gold buried under someone's house they don't even know is there, right? Or space. Can space be defiled? Can space be made dirty or impure? What would that mean? Impurities can sort of be, in order to exist, whatever existence you want to ascribe to them, impurities have to exist in space, but the space itself is the same whether there's stuff in it or not, right? The gold that's buried, the gold that's covered in mud, is the same whether it's covered in mud or not. The mud doesn't change the nature of the gold. So there's a funny word. A lot of this stuff got translated for the first time in the 19th century. And so there are these funny kind of like Victorianisms that slip in. One of my favorites is adventitious. It's a word that just simply means nothing to modern English speakers. Intermittent is a maybe better word, but the point is it comes and goes. It's not inherent. It's not necessary. It's adventitious. So this stuff, and in this you would include ultimately, I think, not even any kind of concept by definition, right? Is going to, I mean, it's right there in the word. So concepts, thoughts, but also even just the phenomenal duality of subject and object come and go. When they're gone, during those periods of meditation where this is absent, where this structure is absent, That's the perfected nature. That's the gold. That's the space. That's, you could say, Buddha nature, right? So when we practice Mahamudra, what are we doing in theory? Or, according to the instruction manuals and teachings of our gurus, we are learning how to suspend this. And then this, it's not produced. It was always already there. It was simply obscured by this, right? Does that make sense? You see?
You think about the words, the structures in Mahamudra, the 4 yogas of Mahoba.
Okay.
Sthiti, Praja, rotate, movement, how do they respond?
Right. So I kind of want to kick that to Rinpoche, but
Okay.
but I will say, first, as a historical matter, that's a later development.
I guess I'm also asking for the store.
So that's a later development. That's a more particularly Tibetan way of doing it. But I will say, when you talk about non-meditation in particular, right? This is a process. That's where I wanted to end. That's a great place to end it for now. Or again, we can continue. We don't want to take a break. We don't need to take a break. I can just continue. There are, broadly speaking, 2 ways of looking at this picture. This is not in the original. This is not like something you'll find in the text. Is the way that scholars talk about it, but I think it's correct. And there's definitely, the scholars are identifying two tendencies, not in opposition. They're sort of complementary, that are real, that are there in the source material, which is, one model is the pivot model, where the dependent nature is like a pivot point for our ordinary lives, for ordinary sentient beings, especially those who haven't taken refuge or anything like that. It pivots here, and this is where we hang out almost always. But when we practice, it could pivot here, right? So there are these, you could say, appearances that are non-dual. This is, in particular, things like visualization practice, in theory, how it's supposed to work, right? When we do tantric deity yoga, there are appearances, there are colors, but they're not dualistic, is the idea in theory, right? So there's a pivot. This never goes away, the dependent nature on the pivot model. It simply changes the mode of appearance. Then you have a progressive model where, again, the imagined nature, the constructed nature is our kind of ordinary unexamined experience. And the dependent nature is what you could access when subject-object duality goes away. Appearances without subject and object. But there's something implicitly, subtly wrong. There's some there's something suspect about appearances, even appearances without subject and object, to whatever extent we want to talk about this. I know Rinpoche has taught about this in the past. I don't know if you, where you could talk about sort of impure appearances, pure appearances, and non-appearance, to sort of get back to the 4 yogas of Yampopa. Point being, there's a progression from dualistic appearance to non-dual appearance to non-appearance, or as I and on this model, because it's again not like one of the primary background concerns for Yogacara is to avoid the danger of a kind of nihilism that comes along with a careless interpretation of Nagarjuna's Madhyāntavibhāga, yes? So, and that you see that reflected in the positive metaphors of gold, especially in the Gyulama. In Dharmakirti, and we'll be talking about Dharmakirti tomorrow and Friday. And it's not just Dharmakirti, by the way. I mean, this is also in the earlier material as well. It's just for Dharmakirti in particular, when you're talking about this level, there's no subject or object, and there's no differentiated appearances. There's no like blue over here versus yellow over there. But it's not nothing. It's pure luminosity. Prakasha in Sanskrit. Pure luminosity. And that's also, I mean, that's again sort of right. That's even closer to the traditional Mahamudra teachings in India. Any other questions? Did you want to take a break? We could continue. I mean, it's up to you guys. Yes, please.
Should be a good question. Unfortunately, I can't find the reference because I think it's audible and not the text. But to get a sense of the Yogacara school's kind of like essence or whatever, I recently heard a really pithy kind of thing going through each of the various ways we can think. So the Shravaka, I'm just going to try to.
It's fine.
And you think that. The Shravaka is concerned or worried about falling into the reified self. The Bodhisattva is worried about losing passion. And the Madhyāntavibhāga is worried about falling into the extremes of existence and non-existence. What's the Yogacara worried about?
Duality. Any kind of duality. In fact, there's an interesting development, historical development, in the texts of Vasubandhu, where in the earlier earlier Mahayana Yoga and Yogacara material written by Vasubandhu, or attributed in any case to Vasubandhu, when he talks about duality, dvaya, actually this phenomenal language is not so much there. Really, it's much closer to either some of the sutra materials or some of the Nagarjunian Madhyamaka materials. It's about like the duality of long and short. What does it mean to say something's long? Well, this is a conventional designation that only has any kind of semantic meaning in relation to some kind of concept of short. Good and bad, dark and light, whatever, right? It's a point being made about language and thought and how our concepts inherently sort of imply their opposite in order to be intelligible at all. Now, that never goes away, and that's very important, including for, Dharmakirti's philosophy of language, which we'll talk about probably tomorrow. But over time, even just in the sequence of, you can sort of suss out some kind of development in Vasubandhu's, or at least the text attributed to Vasubandhu. Over time, the the emphasis shifts from being about duality in that kind of conceptual sense to specifically a phenomenal duality of phenomenal subject and phenomenal object. The common thread, of course, is the duality itself. And I will say, I mean, again, you could say, well, how is that different from the Madhyāntavibhāga thing? Well, in a sense, it's not, which is why these things go to. So I started by saying there are two chariots, right? Or the metaphor here, it's not even. It's like two. The metaphor is like one chariot with two horses, really. When you talk about two chariots, it's really like a team of horses with, on either side. So they go together. But for the Madhyāntavibhāga, it's not. Yes, there's duality, but no. Remember, when we were reading yesterday, it's not just neither existent nor non-existent. It's also not both and not neither, right? I like to imagine this as like orthogonal. Like if you define like a Cartesian plane with like existence, non-existence, both and neither, like Madhyāntavibhāga is like sticking out. Like we're just not even dealing with this whole plane, right? Versus in this picture, the specific object of analysis, the specific object of critique is most specifically duality. At first, kind of maybe somewhat vague or conceptual, but then over time, really zeroing in on the sense of self, the sense of phenomenal subjectivity in opposition or relation to an external world.
Would it be safe to say that the Prasangika Madhyāntavibhāga isn't concerned about duality?
So there's this fun, so prasanga is a Sanskrit word. It means something like reductio ad absurdum, an unacceptable consequence. Indian logic, which we'll talk about more tomorrow, predates the Buddhist engagement with it. Like there's something like 300-400 years of Indian logic before Buddhists started engaging with it. Prasanga is just like one of the tools in the toolkit employed to great effect famously by Nagarjuna. Around the year 600, so 300-400 years after Nagarjuna, 200-300 years after Vasubandhu, a complete unknown named Chandrakirti writes a text called Entering the Middle Way that is completely ignored for 400 years. Total non-entity, totally ignored. Around the year 1000, in Northeast India, Vikramashila Mahavihara, there is a circle of scholar practitioners call themselves Arya, the noble circle, who are particularly focused on the Guhya Samaja Tantra, the gathering of secrets Tantra. One of the patriarchs of this Arya circle calls himself Nagarjuna. This is why you will occasionally see in Tibetan historical sources and Indian historical sources the idea that Nagarjuna lived for like 500 or 600 years. It's not, I wouldn't say it's impossible, but these are fairly clearly distinct historical personages, or the works associated with them separated by half a millennium, at least. Another one of these figures calls himself Chandrakirti. He writes a commentary on the Guhya Samaja that is historically very, very important. It's a kind of reference manual on how to do Guhya Samaja tantric practice. Very influential, very quickly. And in fact, another one of these tantrikas in this circle is Ratnakara Shanti, who I mentioned yesterday. My master's thesis I wrote, it was a translation and analysis of one of Ratnakara Shanti's exoteric works. He also wrote esoteric tantric commentaries. In the colophon to this text, Ratnakara Shanti, who would have been like personal friends with the Chandrakirti who wrote the Pradipodhyotana, the light that illuminates the Guhya Samaja Tantra. You would have known, it would have like been practicing together with him, friends with him. Says that the earlier Chandrakirti, which is to say the author of the Madhyāntavibhāga Avatara, entering the middle way, this commentary on Nagarjuna that it was ignored, roundly ignored for 400 years, perverted the intent of Nagarjuna, that he was a nihilist with wrong view. But for sort of complicated historical reasons, I've already given too much historical digression, but whatever. This, well, the essence of it is that on the basis of on the strength of the reputation of an author named Chandrakirti, who wrote this very influential tantric commentary, this earlier work rose to prominence. There's a great book by Kevin Vose called Resurrecting Chandrakirti, highly recommended. The short version is the later Tibetan sort of historiography around the so-called Prasangika lineage is all made up. It's fabricated. None of these people existed. And yes, the method, the analytic method of prasanga, which is a real thing, gets picked up in Tibet called prasang. Actually, it's not correct to call it prasangika because that's not a Sanskrit word. The word in Tibetan is telgyurwa because the word for prasanga in Tibetan is telgyur, meaning literally like unacceptable consequence. So you had these people in Tibet go around calling themselves telgyurwa. That gets back translated into Sanskrit by English speakers in the 20th century as prasangika. There's an edited volume by George Dreyfus and Sarah McClintock. It goes into the historiography, and you'll notice if you pick up this, is it in the library? Do we know? It's a good book to have here. Yeah. On the title page of the edited volume on this question, there's an asterisk by prasangika because it is not a Sanskrit word. I mentioned, what was it? The external world. So pop quiz. What's the dependent nature? Anyone? Paul, you asked. I gave you an answer. Do you remember it? The 8 consciousnesses. That's exactly right. So what's the only candidate for a real thing in this picture? This is the 8 collections of consciousness. This is X, right? Gone. Not real. This is empty of that. The emptiness of duality in reality is the perfected, which itself is, you could say, Buddha nature. Okay. This is not an external world, an extramental world, a material world. This is also not an extramental material world. This is also not an extramental material world, but it doesn't, who cares? So this is why sometimes Yogacara gets called Chittamatra, mind only, or Vijnanavada, the view that Vijnana, like we were saying yesterday, Vijnana, the consciousness or awareness. The view that consciousness is, in a sense, all that exists, right? What does that mean? It's a good question. This gets, for some reason, it doesn't quite, there's I think an emotional impulse, or I don't know exactly. There's again, a kind of tendency among some scholars to want to defang this, or to make it about, what we can know instead of what's really there, as though these were like things, we could separate the knowable from the existent, which is not a Buddhist. I mean, this is, Dharmakirti will go out and say, point blank, Sattvam upalabdhir evam, that which exists is that which is perceptible or knowable. Which is, I mean, Dharmakirti didn't invent that. That's standard. Let's see if I can read. Unfortunately, I'm having technical problems with my computer, but I wanted to pull up. There's another extremely important text of Vasubandhu called the 20 Verses. The 20 Verses, the Viṃśatikā. I'll jump to the key part, verse 11. The rhetorical objector, interlocutor says, because the point of Vasubandhu's 20 verses is he's teaching mind only. The objector says, how then should one understand this? Namely, that while the Blessed One spoke of the existence of the sense fields of visible form, i.e. rupa, and the rest, with this special intention, those things which come to be the corresponding objects of the manifestations of visible form and the rest do not actually exist at all. To which Vasubandhu responds, that sense field of visible form and the rest, i.e. rupa, is not unitary nor atomically plural sense object, since those atoms are nor are those atoms compounded, since the atom, the particle, itself is not established. What is stated here? Whatever sensory field consisting of visible form and the rest that would be the corresponding sense object of the manifestations of visible form and the rest would either be unitary or it would be an aggregation of atoms. First of all, the sense object is not unitary because there is no apprehension anywhere at all of a material form as a part-possessing whole separate from its parts. This, I hope, is familiar from our first day. If it isn't, please let me know. Nor is it plural, because there is no apprehension of particles individually. Nor would those particles compounded come to be the sense object, since the atom is not proved to be a singular substance. And the objector is livid. What do you mean the atom, the particle, as a singular substance is not proven? To which Vasubandhu replies, because either in the simultaneous conjunction with a group of 6 atoms, the atoms would have 6 parts. If there were a simultaneous conjunction with 6 atoms from the 6 directions of possible orientation, this would result in the atom having 6 parts, because where there is one thing, another cannot arise. Or because the 6 being in a common location, the cluster would be the extent of a single atom, which is to say the place in which there are 6 atoms would be precisely the same as the place of a single atom. For this reason, because all of them would be in a common location, the entire cluster would be the extent of a single atom, because they would not exclude one another. Thus, no cluster would be visible at all. The Kashmiri Vaibhashikas, which is to say essentially the Sarvastivadins, say, atoms do not at all conjoin because of being partless. Absolutely not. But compounded things do conjoin with one another. This should be questioned as follows. Since a compound of atoms is not something separate from those atoms, given that there is no conjunction of atoms, what is conjoining when those atoms are compounded? What is Vasubandhu getting at here? Do some Where did I lost, oh, here we go. I'll put it here. Okay. At a first approximation, you can regard a particle as a spherical shell. This is, physics 101, right? 2,000 years ago as today. All right. When we speak of an elementary particle, a quantum, as in quantum physics, we are speaking about one thing. Why is it a quantum? What is a quantum? An indivisible quantity. Okay. One particle by itself, one electron, let's say, is quite literally invisible. From a modern scientific perspective, we could say that the resolution, in order to be able to, let's say, bounce light off the physical extent of the classical radius of an electron is smaller than the wavelength of the light that you would need to bounce off of it to hit your eye to see it. There is quite literally nothing that it could possibly mean to quote unquote see a single particle. What do we see on a basic atomist account? What do we see? We see an agglomeration. Many atoms, many particles, many quanta together, right? Somehow these must be conjoined. But how? Because there's a problem. If we say, when he says six, what he means is like one, 4 cardinal directions and then top and bottom. If we say that a molecule is a conjunction of atoms in a naive sense, okay, well, now we have a problem, because now we're talking about a cluster, a composite of individually indivisible entities, except now we have a part of the atom that's touching the other atom, and a part of the atom that's not touching the other atom. Uh-oh. In order to be real, these must be indivisible, partless. And yet, in order to be visible, they need to have parts. Okay, and then we say, oh, no, we don't, let's get rid of that. Doesn't work, fine. We're not going to draw this distinction between the part that touches and the part that doesn't. Well, now you have an even bigger problem, because now you have no way to distinguish. You want to say you have this particle over here and this particle over here, and somehow there's a part of them that touches and a part of them that don't. No, we don't have that. Okay, well, now you have lost any way to distinguish spatially between these particles. So that the whole thing collapses. And now all the particles that are conjoined occupy the same space, the extent of a single atom. If the cluster is not other than the atoms, the two, the shadow and the obstruction, would not be properties of that cluster. If you do not accept the cluster as something other than the atoms, then it is proven that the two, the shadow and the obstruction, are not properties of that cluster. Objection: this is mere imaginative speculation, i.e. parikalpa, about construction. Why do you have this worry about whether it is an atom or a compound? In any case, the characteristic of visible form, i.e. rupa, and the rest is not negated. Vasubandhu asks, then what is their characteristic? Being a sense field of visual perception and the rest, and blueness and the like are the characteristics of rupa. Vasubandhu, this is precisely what is being determined. Is the sense field of visual perception and the rest you accept as blue and yellow and so on a single substance, or rather multiple? If the sense object were singular, there would be no gradual motion, no simultaneous apprehension and non-apprehension, nor divided multiple existence, nor the individual microscopic. He elaborates, if one imagines the visual sense object, blue and the rest, as long as it is undivided, to be a single substance, there would not be gradual motion on the ground, going, that is to say, because everything would be traversed with a single footstep. How can you have spatial extension? And the apprehension of a facing portion and the non-apprehension of the non-facing portion would not be simultaneous, because the apprehension and non-apprehension of the very same thing at that same time is not reasonable. And there would be no existence of divided and multiple elephants and horses and so on in a single place, because one thing would be just precisely where another is. How could a division between them be reasonable? Or on the other hand, how isn't it reasonable that place is single, which is both occupied by those two elephants and horse and not occupied, since one apprehends the gap between them is empty of the two? And if you were to imagine the two to have a difference in substance, purely because of a distinction in characteristic feature, not otherwise, microscopic aquatic creatures, having extended forms like macroscopic creatures, would not be invisible. Therefore, since this is not the case, one must certainly imagine a distinction atomically, and that atom is not established to be singular. Since the singular atom is not proven, the fact that visible form and the rest, the sense fields of the visual and the rest, is unproven. Therefore, manifestation only, viññapti matra, another synonym of chitta matra, comes to be proven. Some of you probably heard of Ernst Mach, as in Mach speed, who's a physicist, also a philosopher, also a phenomenologist. In the 1890s, 1870s to I don't remember his. Ernst Mach was 1838 to 1916. 1838 to 1916 writes, bodies do not produce sensations, but complexes of elements, complexes of sensations, make up bodies. If to the physicist bodies appear to be real abiding existences, while the elements are regarded merely as their evanescent transitory appearance, the physicist forgets, in the assumption of such a view, that all bodies are but thought symbols for complexes of sensations. Thus, if ordinary matter must be regarded merely as a highly natural, unconsciously constructed mental symbol for a relatively stable complex of sensational elements, much more must this be the case with the artificial hypothetical atoms and molecules of physics and chemistry. This is one of the most famous physicists of all time. What we call matter is a combination of the elements of sensations according to certain laws, certain causal regularities. Yes?
So true study is just impossible.
No. No. What is truth? What is absolute truth? What is ultimately real on this picture? Is this devoid of that?
And reality that is impossible.
That's where we get tripped up.
I just want to mention this book that I studied for decades, called The Evolution of Beauty, which was written by Maitreya. And he refuted all ornithological data about evolution of birds. The evolution of beauty is about dinosaurs, these specific creatures evolving into some of the most, subjectively beautiful animals on Earth, this evolution. His discovery from in having these graduate students pull all the research data that explored Darwin's laws of evolution. And the fact that these Victorian scientists totally ignored Darwin's second law and tried to prove that the evolution was solely driven by survival of the strongest of fittest. And one was able to prove their prejudice by using their own research where their own conclusions they threw these conclusions away due to their societal disease. That the birds will make decisions, arbitrary decisions about female natures and who the girl birds wanted to mate with. And that the entire evolution of birds was driven by female victims. And these Victorian researchers all the way up to the 1980s threw this research away, despite the fact that the data say the female birds were arbitrarily decided.
So the question, so the question here is, what is data, right? Which comes from the Latin word. So data is the plural of datum, that which has been given, the given. I could go on about, there's a very famous essay called The Myth of the Given that we could talk about maybe later, maybe after class. But what is given? What does it mean for something to be given? Is material reality given? What would it mean? This is where I wanted to go with this, and thank you for that. Yes. What would it mean for material reality, let's say, in and of itself? What would it mean for material reality to be in and of itself? What would it mean for material reality to be given in and of itself? Because material reality, to whatever extent we want to talk about, again, actually, I didn't emphasize this on day one, and I'll say it now. Rupa, this word that I keep saying, right? Like, rupa is the Sanskrit word for physical stuff, matter. It's also the word for visible stuff, which is to say the proper object of the visual consciousness. What do we see is rupa. We see matter, but we also see visible form. Is visible form, or visual appearances, the same thing as physical matter? Already by the Victorian era, certainly by Mach's time, it was well understood this was not the case. Actually, the Greeks already understood this as well, and Islamic scholars developed the theories of optics that fed into Johannes Kepler's development of the telescope. We do not see matter. Matter, physical matter, which is in the sense of agglomerations of physical particles, is invisible, right? What we see are the effects, the cognitive effects produced by the causal interaction between whatever you want to, let's hypothesize the existence of extramental matter. If we want to assume that there exists such a thing as extramental matter, this is not what we see. What we see is the effect, the cognitive effect, the visual cognitive effect produced by the interaction between matter, light, and our minds, right? And that is what is getting at here. And that is what, so this is the kind of subtle distinction that gets played up, I think, somewhat illegitimately sometimes by modern contemporary scholars, Because it is true, there is an epistemological point. You could, in theory, say, well, okay, we don't see atoms because atoms individually are invisible. They're only visible in aggregate. If we set aside the lovely critique of atomism that Vasubandhu just delivered, we could hypothesize, okay, there are agglomerations of atoms. We don't see them directly, but we see them in a sense indirectly. They are the cause of our visual perceptions. So what we see directly is a kind of representation, a cognitive representation that bears certain structural similarity with the extramental matter. This is the Madhyāntavibhāga, the view that extramental objects exist. And Dharmakirti and the later Yogacaran and Pramanavada tradition allows for this to some extent. It's not the best view, it's not the most accurate view, but it's allowable. It's certainly more intuitive. Normally, when we're hanging out in the imaginary nature, certainly we take the objects of our experience, of our subjective experience, to be external physical matter, right? That's how we ordinarily live our lives. So whatever else we want to say, we need some kind of account. We need some kind of explanation that's going to be compatible with that picture. And as we'll see tomorrow and Friday, Dharmakirti goes to great pains to provide an account that allows for the existence of extramental matter. However, it doesn't really work. If you analyze deeply, these problems with atomism, with extramental realism, when you get right down to it, are intractable, unsolvable. And what are we left with? Manifestation only, appearances only, mind only. Yogacara. Any other questions? We have like 5 minutes. Please, yeah. Sorry?
Is it possible to see the nature of mind without understanding other possible?
Sure. I mean, like, I mean, yeah, why not? I think it's harder. I will say this. I think maybe projecting, speaking for myself and projecting, as inhabitants of modernity, I think our minds, and certainly anyone who's gone through 16 plus years of the modern education system, the sort of traumatizing effect that has on your mind, we come to expect to require a certain kind of intellectual explanation. Otherwise, we have many doubts, many questions. So it's certainly possible. I would say if you've been subjected to the modern education system, as I think pretty much everyone in this room has, the kinds of questions that you, as a result of your trauma, will find yourself spinning around asking are unanswerable without at least some degree of study. But if you're fortunate enough not to have been traumatized by modern education, then yeah, sure, whatever. Hillary, you look like you have a question. Oh. Okay, well, I think it's lunchtime. So thank you very much for your patience and attention.